Welcome back, squad, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today I want to look at some of the roles played by the Old Forest in The Lord of the Rings. In the book, after Frodo arrives safely in Crick Hollow, he decides to avoid traveling by road and cut instead through the Old Forest. Over the next 3 chapters, the hobbits encounter such eldritch horrors as Old Man Willow, Tom Bombadil, the Barrow-wight, and Fatty Lumpkin before returning to the road and arriving in Bree. This whole section is often considered a frustrating outlier, particularly by first-time readers. Even many avid fans of the book also consider these chapters somewhat jarring. Both Jackson's and Bakshi's films skip these events entirely and have the hobbits arrive at the Prancing Pony as their first stop after leaving the Shire, and this is generally considered a good or at least acceptable choice, even by otherwise die-hard purists. It's not that nothing interesting happens in these chapters, and it's also not the case that what does happen is totally irrelevant to the rest of the story. The hobbits show a lot of growth, particularly Frodo, who also experiences a lot of significant dreams, visions, and premonitions. The group learns information that will help them in their journey, and even receives objects that will later be vital to the plot. The Blades of Westerness from the Barrow, one of which will later be used to help defeat the Witch King. A lot of people point to Tom Bombadil as the reason for the seeming incongruity, but that doesn't seem totally fair. Yes, Tom is a bit gaudy, but we have to remember that in Middle-earth, the Evening Star is unironically believed to be Elrond's father sailing in a celestial boat, bearing a jewel brought to him by his bird wife and glowing with the liquid light once emitted by 2 magical trees that were poisoned by a giant space spider. So I think we can accept the existence of a very old entity who likes to dress in bright colors and speak in rhyme without violating our immersion too much. Tom Bombadil's home does have a dreamy, surreal atmosphere, but so does Lothlorien, and no one seems upset about that. So then, why should these chapters stand out as particularly frustrating? I think a big part of the reason is the extent to which the Old Forest subverts the reader's expectations. The hobbits' decision to enter the Old Forest comes at a crucial point in the narrative. The house at Crick Hollow represents the final threshold between the Shire and the rest of Middle-earth, and not just a geographic threshold. Reaching it indicates that the transition between their familiar home and the perilous world beyond it is complete. There are several elements in this transition. During his travels, Frodo has gradually discarded some of the pretenses about the reason for his journey, pretenses that were meant to disguise the meaning of Frodo's departure from spies, but that have also contributed to Frodo's ability to deceive his friends, and to an extent himself, about what's really happening. Upon reaching the edge of the Shire, in the chapter titled A Conspiracy Unmasked, no less, he attempts a partial revelation of his real purposes, only to find that his companions have known the truth the whole time. From this point on, Frodo and his friends can be clear with each other and themselves about their quest. Along with Frodo's true goal, the stakes of the narrative become clear at this point as well. Tension has been steadily rising as the Black Riders pursue the party more and more closely, and at this point the hobbits can no longer deny that the riders are closing in, and it is imperative that the hobbits evade them. We also see Frodo literally leaving his old identity behind, assuming the name Mr. Underhill. On the surface, this is simply part of the secret escape plan, but Tolkien, of all people, would be sensitive to the significance of a character ceasing to use one name and taking on a new one. Fatty Bolger even plans to disguise himself as Frodo to further the illusion, which means that to all appearances, the old Frodo Baggins of the Shire is being left behind. Finally, Frodo is now forced to take more personal responsibility for the quest, instead of deferring to the plan worked out ahead of time with Gandalf's input. Frodo had hoped to find either a message from Gandalf or Gandalf himself at Crick Hollow, but finding neither, Frodo must make the small but important choice of what path to take next on his own. All these changes happening at once cue the reader to expect the next scenes will go a certain way. If we were using the model of the monomyth or hero's journey, this would be the stage described as crossing the threshold, or the start of the initiation into the new world. We might predict that the pace will get faster and the stakes higher, that new characters with significance to the plot will continue to appear and share clarifying information, and most of all, that the main conflict will be engaged with more and more directly. All these expectations are satisfied once the hobbits reach Bree, but first, Frodo chooses to leave the road, both literally and figuratively, and venture into the Old Forest, where the hobbits get lost in a hostile wood and attacked by a sentient willow. Tom Bombadil rescues them and they recover in his home before daring the Barrow Downs, where they again get lost and captured, this time by a Barrow Wight, before Tom saves them again and leads them back to the road to Bree. While these adventures do serve as the initiation the story demands, it's not the kind of initiation that readers expect. Instead of entering a new stage of the conflict the story has already established, in the Old Forest, the conflict itself is what changes. So far, the story's central problem has been framed with deceptive simplicity as being between characters with opposing goals. Sauron and all his minions want to recover the ring so Sauron can take over the world. Everyone who would rather not be conquered by Sauron wants to resist him, to a greater or lesser extent depending on the particulars of each case. There's certainly a lot more to it than that, but on the surface, especially this early on, the conflict appears straightforward. By going into the Old Forest, the hobbits stop the buildup of this conflict in its tracks. They succeed in their goal to evade the Black Riders, who do not appear again until Bree. Now, it turns out that the Nazgul may have some connection to the threats this region poses after all. In the appendices, we learn that evil spirits were first sent into the Barrow Downs by the Witch King. And in accounts published in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien further remarks that during the hunt for the ring, the Witch King roused the Barrow-wights, and all things of evil spirit hostile to elves and men were on the watch with malice in the Old Forest and on the Barrow Downs. However, these details are not made obvious in the novel itself, so to the reader, the dangers the hobbits face feel curiously disconnected from the pursuit of the Black Riders, who until this point have been the main representation of the story's central problem. The ring continues to cause trouble, but with the riders out of the picture, that trouble is now mostly internal, a temptation that Frodo struggles with on his own rather than an external influence. Bombadil's indifference and immunity to the ring decentralizes it even further, this maybe being one of the reasons that Tom is often blamed for the sense of incongruency in this section. With the main story sidelined, the hobbits now seem to be pitted against the natural world, but careful reading suggests that something else may be going on. This is particularly true in the chapter I want to focus on today, the Old Forest. While it may be an uncivilized and dangerous wilderness compared to the Shire, the Old Forest is not exactly unknown territory. Frodo has already been in it once before, Merry claims to have entered it several times, and stories about its powers are widely known. Despite their foreknowledge, though, the hobbits find the forest unusually difficult to navigate, and even overtly hostile, leading them to question their own perceptions even as the readers develop their own doubts about the reliability of the narrative. Even the writing style helps to create this impression. Leaving aside Tolkien's general appreciation for landscape and setting, particularly forests, the prose in this chapter describes the hobbits' progress, or lack thereof, so painstakingly it can become boring. Until, that is, you notice the eerie mismatch between the tone of the writing and some of the events being described. As successive false starts increase tension but fail to lead to any payoff, the reader is as likely to get stuck in paragraphs of description as the hobbits themselves are to get caught in a thicket. All the while, the hobbits, Merry in particular, display a counterproductive double consciousness. Merry admits that the trees of the Old Forest are more alive than normal trees, and they don't like strangers, yet he also scoffs at his companion's fear, saying the trees don't pose any serious danger. They are usually content merely to watch you as long as daylight lasts, and don't do much. Occasionally, the most unfriendly ones may drop a branch or stick a root out or grasp at you with a long trailer. Despite his confidence, though, Merry struggles to find the way even to their first landmark. Nevertheless, the hobbits try again and again to reorient themselves and head in the direction they want to go, even as the forest hems them in and herds them deeper into its center, along paths that it's chosen for them. This puts our heroes into something of a pickle. The hobbits began their journey under the premise that the Old Forest is not nearly as dangerous as rumor would have it. It may be disorienting, difficult to navigate, and, most of all, not laid out for the convenience of those that go on two legs, but it also seems to be the safest choice open to them. Before they leave, Frodo tells Fatty, "If there are no worse things ahead than the Old Forest, I shall be lucky." As they get lost, the hobbits increasingly blame their disorientation on the ill will of the trees, yet they continue to use the same ordinary methods of pathfinding in their attempt to escape, acting as though the forest poses no threat that they can't conquer, even as evidence to the contrary mounts. Things escalate when the hobbits are led into the Withywindle Valley, the one place they were most trying to avoid. At this point, the hobbits' denial comes to the forefront. Even as the mood becomes more ominous and urgent, the hobbits start to get sleepy, literally losing awareness of their surroundings. Merry and Pippin fall asleep against the Great Willow and are soon trapped inside its trunk. To his credit, Frodo at least gets the feeling that stopping to rest here is a bad idea. He tries to fight off his sleepiness by going to bathe his feet in the river, which turns out to be a terrible idea and another example of the risks of self-deceptive doublethink. If Frodo's drowsiness is of natural origin, then climbing out on a root hanging over a body of water is probably not a smart move. As Sam later tactfully observes, you shouldn't sit in such a place if you feel sleepy. If this drowsiness is unnatural, though, then it follows that so too is Frodo's overwhelming desire for cool water. Plus, Frodo's already been told that the river itself is the very source of the forest's uncanny powers, so it seems very unlikely that the water is going to help. Frodo's desperation to resist enchantment, while continuing to deny the nature of what's happening to him, leads to this fragmented and dangerous logic and nearly gets him drowned. Of all the hobbits, Sam is the one to recognize that the willow is working some enchantment, which makes him less susceptible to it. Sam is a gardener, which means he's under fewer illusions about just how persistent vegetation can be in pursuit of its own goals, and how much work is required to make the natural world productive and useful. It's also Sam who suggests threatening the tree with fire, but this only makes the willow angry. Sam may be less sheltered than his companions, but his admirable horticultural zeal to make the plant bend to his will also proves to be a form of hubris, proving he can't save his friends through sheer force of will alone. Luckily, of course, Tom Bombadil is around to come to the rescue. There's a lot that can be said about Tom, but what's most relevant here is the degree to which his power stems from his knowledge of the forest, where he's lived since basically the beginning of time. Tom knows this place so well that he's become immune to its perils. As he tells the hobbits, he knows how to deal with Old Man Willow because he knows the song for him. His house is comfortable and well-maintained, but it's not fenced off from its surroundings. And through Tom's stories, the hobbits start to see the forest from a new perspective. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest, apart from themselves. Indeed, to feel themselves as the strangers, where all other things were at home. One reason the hobbits have been so unwilling to accept their powerlessness against the forest is that as lovers of peace, quiet, and good-tilled earth, the Shire's inhabitants assume that nature is, and ought to be, orderly and pleasant, a worldview that doesn't leave much room to appreciate nature in itself, or admit to the dangers it might inherently possess. When the forest proves disorderly and unpleasant, they react with resentment, fear, and loathing. And the novel, which is written from their perspective, describes it as menacing, dreary, and abominable. The truth is likely both simpler and more subtle. Instead of being pure evil, the Old Forest, and maybe even the Great Willow, could simply be defensive. After all, both The Lord of the Rings and the metatextual annals and histories that accompany it tell us that the Old Forest was once much bigger. The forest's decline began well before the arrival of hobbits in the area, but even they have had a hand in damaging it. Merry recounts what he calls a war against the trees, in which the hobbits cut down and burned hundreds of trees after they began growing near and hanging over the hobbits' protective hedge. In a letter to the editor of the Daily Telegraph, Tolkien wrote, "In all my works, I take the part of trees, as against all their enemies. Lothlorien is beautiful because there the trees were loved. Elsewhere, forests are represented as awakening to consciousness of themselves. The Old Forest was hostile to two-legged creatures because of the memory of many injuries." In an article that I will link below, scholar Katrine Hjulstad argues that this letter suggests Tolkien's own attitude toward the Old Forest may have differed from the one expressed by his characters, a fact that might be obscured by the care that Tolkien took to preserve the point of view of the hobbits in writing The Lord of the Rings. Moreover, the novel itself often expresses the idea that just because someone or something is dangerous, perilous, or even downright hostile, that doesn't necessarily mean it's on the side of Sauron. Less alarming examples include Treebeard, who insists that he's not entirely on anyone's side, and Galadriel, who is repeatedly characterized as perilous despite her undeniable goodness. Even Gandalf voices this principle when Gimli expresses doubts about whether Fangorn is dangerous. "Dangerous," cried Gandalf, "and so am I, very dangerous. More dangerous than anything you will ever meet, unless you are brought alive before the seat of the Dark Lord. And Aragorn is dangerous, and Legolas is dangerous. You are beset with dangers, Gimli, son of Glóin, for you are dangerous yourself, in your own fashion." Finally, the hobbits do eventually encounter a contrasting example of a threat that is undeniably evil, unnatural, and connected to Sauron: the Barrow-wight. The Wight and the Willow are both dangerous, and they use similar tactics, bewildering their targets with sung enchantments before sealing them away. But Tom Bombadil, who has power over both, deals with each very differently. In the case of the Wight, Tom breaks open its barrow, tells it to vanish and be forgotten, and scatters its horde to break its spell forever. However, he doesn't attack or destroy Old Man Willow. Rather, Tom tells the tree what it ought to be doing. You should not be waking. Eat earth, dig deep, drink water, go to sleep. Tom knows and accepts what the willow truly is, and he neutralizes its malice by working with its nature rather than against it. The journey through the Old Forest demonstrates that the greatest risk the hobbits face is their own inability to see the world as it really is. In clinging to their preconceptions, they alternate between carelessness and panic. If they are to survive the dangers ahead of them, they must first learn to see those dangers clearly, even if the knowledge is uncomfortable. We see this lesson start to take hold during the hobbits' next misadventure. The party sets out from Tom Bombadil's house with renewed confidence, only to repeat many of the same mistakes they made in the forest. Despite Tom's advice and their own people's legends, they underestimate the peril of their path and unwisely fall asleep in a vulnerable situation. A force of nature, fog instead of trees this time, causes them to lose their way, and they are trapped by a hostile figure from whom Tom must rescue them. At this point, the conflict has started to shift back toward the main story, with an antagonist who is directly connected with the threat posed by Sauron. The Wight's chant even references the triumph of the Dark Lord. Although the Wight poses a different kind of threat than Old Man Willow does, their similarities allow us to see that the lessons learned in the Old Forest still apply against the servants of Sauron. Although they still end up captured by the Wight, this time, instead of allowing rationalization and denial to impair his judgment, Frodo recognizes the nature and severity of the threat right away. In the forest, Frodo's cries for help are anything but a reasoned decision. Frodo, without any clear idea of why he did so or what he hoped for, ran along the path crying, "Help, help, help!" He felt desperate, lost, and witless. Tom later tells Frodo that he didn't even hear his cries, and it's only chance, if chance you call it, that brought him in their direction. To escape the Barrow, Frodo first has to overcome his wild impulse to leave his friends and run, summon his deeply buried courage, and exercise his wits sufficiently to remember not only what he's supposed to do, but the rhyming verse he has to use to do it. Luck, or fate, saved the hobbits from Old Man Willow, but Frodo plays an active and conscious role in saving them from the Wight, because he's learning to recognize when he's outmatched and needs to surrender himself into the protection of others. Even after these two harrowing experiences, in Bree, the hobbits continue to put themselves at risk through blithe overconfidence. Lulled once more, not into sleep but into carelessness by the familiarity and apparent safety of their surroundings. Fortunately, this time Frodo spots the signs of things spinning out of control in time to narrowly avoid absolute catastrophe. He then makes his first truly good independent decision, the choice to accept Strider's offer to act as their guide. On the surface, this is a tremendously risky move, and understandably his companions are hesitant to entrust their lives to a rascally-looking ranger with a nasty reputation, who knows far too much about their supposedly secret mission, and who represents just about everything the tidy, proper, and pragmatic Shire is against. But while such hobbit sense has its undeniable worth, it also has its limitations, and Frodo and company have just seen firsthand where those limitations can lead, even without the active, overtly evil threat of Sauron and his minions. Of course, it helps that Gandalf's letter immediately confirms Frodo's choice, but as Sam points out, even the letter isn't a guarantee that the man claiming to be Strider is trustworthy. If he were still in denial about the desperation of their position, Frodo could have insisted that everything was going according to plan and turned Strider away. Instead, he accepts just how far out of his depth he is. After all, as terrifying as that knowledge may be, the risks of staying ignorant are demonstrably worse. His intuition has also improved. Frodo points out that Aragorn looks foul but feels fair, showing his increased awareness that what seems to be the easiest, safest, or most convenient choice is very often not the right one. In the house at Crick Hollow, the hobbits had been deluded into believing they understood what they were up against. After all, they'd successfully brought the ring to the borders of the Shire while evading the Black Riders, all without Gandalf's help. And Frodo's clever companions had worked out what his journey was really about before he could even tell them. While they claim to be dreadfully afraid, they really don't seem to be as concerned as they should be. Singing and dancing the night before they set out, and planning to dress Fatty Bulger up to throw the riders off the scent without fully thinking through how much danger this might expose him to. Had the group gone straight on to Bree in this state, they likely would not have left alive. But instead, they enter the Old Forest, where nature itself erodes their willful ignorance and teaches them just enough to let them survive the next challenge. Not to get too meta here, but the thing that I find absolutely brilliant about this is that the narrative frustration posed to readers by the Old Forest episode also reflects this theme. As I mentioned at the beginning, the expected course of action would be to omit this escapade with yellow-booted anomalies and whispering willows, and proceed directly to the scenes in Bree, to stay on the road, in other words. But forcing a story inside rigid confines that don't allow for digression and exploration isn't always the right move, and sometimes inconvenient overgrowth has more to teach us than might appear. In this case, getting lost in the Old Forest challenges the reader to question the apparent simplicity of the story's moral themes. Yes, the Nazgul are terrifying, the ring is evil, and Sauron is an existential threat, but the real point of the story lies in the characters' internal struggles. Like the hobbits, the readers must surrender their preconceptions about what kind of story this is before they can successfully engage with it. If you enjoyed this video, slap the like button so that the gnarled and hoary algorithm will unwind its branches from around our collective necks. If you enjoy getting lost in the forests of Tolkien lore, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. Thank you to everyone for watching, and particular thanks to my Patreon supporters who make all of this possible, especially DD, John H. Austin Jr., Gandalf the Grey, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Bitso Bongo, Dorwin Gray, Kevin Hjulstad, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12-String, Luke, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, and Jared Carver. Until next time, remember to be nice to the trees and stay on the path.